Awesome. All right.
Got it.
All right.
Good to be starting this again.
Oh, that's good to hear, Philip. Thanks. Yeah. All right. Let's welcome back, everybody. As usual, there's a whole bunch of new people that have signed up to show up, but are not showing up. So they might come a little bit later. Yeah, how to start off. We're going to be doing nature today. We're going to start off on Aristotle's concept of nature. Let me see. I guess what I just kind of want to start off with, I don't want to review everything we did before because that would take too long, but I have been chewing on the concept of concept that we worked out in the chapters on change. And I didn't realize that was going to be such a fertile passage, not only for thinking about Aristotle, but for thinking about philosophy generally and the nature of philosophical concepts as opposed to concepts employed in the empirical sciences. And I kind of wanted just to rehearse the basic idea behind this concept of change, right? I call this a concept, but of course, Aristotle calls it an account, a logos. And this seems like it's going to cause some problems because we tend to think of concepts as mental representations and therefore having some kind of mental nature, whereas an account or a statement of what a thing is doesn't seem to be really anything mental. And so I wanted to just talk briefly about about this fact that I'm using the term concept, and Aristotle isn't. He uses account, he uses logos. And in order to understand why I'm speaking about it this way, we have to understand what was involved in the elaboration and the establishment of that concept in the first place. And the concept of change, or the logos of change that Aristotle develops, we noted, was a consequence of Parmenides' refutation of the idea that anything can change. If being is, change is impossible. Now, Aristotle begins this work saying, there is no physics if there is no change. And so we must inquire into whether we can make sense of change or not. And so what Aristotle is doing is he's engaging the Parmenidean denial of change. And in refuting that denial, he sets forth an account of change that is free from the refutation that Parmenides gives. So this concept is one from the jaws of the impossibility of change. So in this concept, the impossibility of change, as Parmenides demonstrated it, and is refuted as part of the content of this concept. All right. It occurs to me that as people come in, maybe I need to make more general comments about this, but I wanted to really get onto this concept thing, right? So what has happened is that we now have an account of change that includes within it a refutation of the impossibility of change, and indeed a refutation based on the very concept of being, the most fundamental refutation there can possibly be. right? Because if being implies that there is no change, then there is also no physics. So this philosophical concept is a philosophical concept for this reason. It expresses the necessary possibility of what it's a concept of, namely change. It does not assume changing things and then try to abstract something common from them, right? Because that obviously assumes that everything we call change and call changing is properly so called, is accurately so called. But what Parmenides did is he showed, well, if you think about change the way we usually think about change, it entails that change is impossible. So we cannot have a concept of change that is abstracted from anything. The account of change, the concept of change, is not an abstraction. And it's very important because it's very important to get this, because we all come to philosophy with the belief that concepts are abstractions. We just do. For some reason, everybody talks about it as if concepts were abstractions. And that's just in our cultural DNA or whatever. Right. And so that's what makes, it's one of the things that makes it so hard to read the Greeks, is because we assume that all concepts are abstractions, and they don't make that assumption. And so we think that they're naive.
Yeah.
Let me see. Somebody trying to say something? Ah, there you go. All right. So I put a lot of emphasis on this concept of change, or the account of change, in order to at least put a wedge in between what an Aristotelian concept is and what our cultural DNA says concepts are. We think of them as abstractions. I have now given you plenty of grounds for at least doubting your assumption that all concepts are abstractions. We now have seen what it would be for a concept to not be an abstraction. For a concept to be an abstraction, we have to assume that there are real instances of a thing like change, and we have to group them together properly. And then we have to extract out what's common to them. And then we have, in each one of us, a mental picture or a set of words that would be our private little abstract concept. And that leads directly to skepticism, right? How do I know that your concept is the same as my concept? And even if we use the same words, we might be thinking of different things, right? It just yields the whole skeptical conundrum. And so by looking to see how a great Greek philosopher establishes a proper account of something, by showing that it is possible, and it does not contain a contradiction, and that its content is derived from the refutation of the Parmenidean objection, that all this together gives us the notion of something that's very different from an abstraction, and very different from very different from an abstraction, and very different from some arbitrary construction or the assumption that some ancient Greek cultural customs are merely channeled in the Aristotelian concept. I heard somebody trying to chime in there, so I'm going to interrupt my flow here and call on Philip.
Yeah, just a quick clarification question. I'm wondering if it's useful in the Greek context to draw a distinction between an abstraction and being abstract. Like, for example, it would seem that a Platonic form is not an abstraction of anything, but it also seems fair to say that it is abstract. And I'm wondering if that distinction can be usefully made within a Greek context.
Maybe in some contexts, I think with ideals. I mean, if you think about abstract is just another form of saying subtraction, taking away. All right. When you abstract or when you subtract, you have less than you had before. Now, if your concern is to know things, then if you abstract from them, then you're leaving something out. Right. And a Platonic idea is the fullest reality of something. It precisely doesn't leave anything out. So if there's some cogency to the Platonic theory of the idea, it can't be because they're abstractions, and it can't be that they're abstract. I'm not denying that abstractions are used quite frequently in scientific work, but what I'm trying to do is put my finger on the fundamental difference between a philosophical concept that is not an abstraction and a, so to speak, five and dime everyday concept that is drawn from our sensory experiences or something like that. So what's interesting about the about Aristotle's concept or Aristotle's account is that it's not an abstraction, and if it's not an abstraction, we can ask, well, what is the proper term for designating such a thing? And what I want to recommend is that we call such intellectual entities determinations. They determine what counts as an instance of themselves, right? And so only when phenomena can be thought as a unity of matter and form and lack put together in the certain way that the concept of change puts them together, can those phenomena count as change. So the concept is in a sense superior to what it's a concept of. It stands in judgment. It is the judge. The concept of change judges what changes. And that is both its philosophical nature and why it's not an empirical scientific concept. And that is why it's only logically criticizable and not empirically criticizable. The other nice thing about the concept of change that we worked on so long is that we have learned that if there is change, there is that things are necessarily, anything that changes is a composite of matter and form, because without matter or the underlying subject and without form, namely a form that it lacks and a form that it gains, there is no change. And so by really digging into this concept of change, we also get ourselves to the point where, like I like to say, where the scholastic manuals tend to begin. They say all things are composites of matter and form. And you can't have matter without form, and you can't have form without matter. The question is, of course, well, why are all things that way? And now we have an excellent answer to that is based not on some empirical generalizations or beliefs by middle-aged white men in Athens, but by thinking what are the necessary components of thinking change, and that change that we think cannot entail the impossibility of change. So all of that goes into this absolutely magnificent concept that Aristotle gives us. And it's just important to lay all of that out, because part of the resistance to the Greeks is that we have our own notions about what a concept is and what matter is and all the rest of it. And I want you to kind of see and appreciate how intrinsically, how deeply interrelated all of these different facets are in the Aristotelian conception, to at least open up a space for you to say, okay, maybe not all concepts are abstractions. Let's see what these Greeks have to say, right? Maybe matter isn't, simply what can be weighed, but maybe the matter of each kind of thing is different. It's not all the same matter, right? Maybe we have to think more about matter and its relationship to form. All right, so that's my justification. I see a bunch of hands, so I'm going to get to the hands now. But I wanted to really, I've been going into this a lot, and I've been repeating myself a lot, and I'm about to stop talking about the concept of change so much. But I wanted to make as clear as possible why I've put so much emphasis on that, and one auxiliary to that is, once we understand that we cannot look to rivers and stars and animals and just stare at them for a little while and then abstract some common thing that they all have and call that change or motion, and that in fact the content of the account of change does not include rivers, and it doesn't include stars, and it doesn't include animals. It includes matter, form, and lack, things that are precisely never given empirically. It is a completely and a total act of the intellect that we have in front of us when we contemplate change. That's the other reason why it's not an abstraction. So we not only have the concept of change, but that we also have things that need to be studied further if we want to comprehend deeply the concept of change. And we have to go from the level of the science that investigates changing things to a new science that can explore what he calls separables, right? Or things that don't change, but are constituents of things that change, like matter, form, and lack. Once we understand this, first. And once we have this, we understand what the relationship is between natural philosophy or natural science and metaphysics in the Aristotelian account. It's the very concept of it's the very content of the concept of change is radically non-empirical. Therefore, looking to what your senses give you will not help you here any further. You must explore matter, you must explore form, and lack, of course, gets translated as capacity or dunamis. And we get into that aspect. So anyway, that's what I have to say generally about that. So I see a bunch of hands, so I'm going to go down the list, and thank you everybody for hearing me out on this. And then when we're done with this, I'll just say a couple things about what we're going to do this semester, and then we'll get into the text. Clark.
Yeah, first of all, Michael, I appreciate you repeating yourself over and over on this issue, because I am totally with you in terms of this being a linchpin.
Yeah.
A basic. This is, I mean, all the time I've spent, starting philosophy and Aristotle with you, to me, it leads up to this point. And it's an impasse if we cannot understand what you're talking about, seems to me, because it's not really worthwhile continuing on with all this if you've got these lingering doubts, right?
Right.
So having said that, what I hear you saying is that Aristotle is not engaged in abstraction,
right,
when he speaks of change.
Right.
So it's not the concept with all these other laden modern conceptions of empirical measurements and all that. But you did say, so I'm following you, but I'm not following you enough.
I understood.
And so the question just around one of the things you said is, how is the act of the intellect not an account of some type of change?
Oh, well, I'm not going to answer that, but it's an excellent, excellent question. So I introduced the term act of the intellect. Aristotle didn't. So I'm actually on thin ice on that one. But I was merely making the point that matter, form, and lack are never are contents that allow us to make sense of what change would have to be if it were real. But these aren't empirical. They're obtained from elsewhere. And since our whole course is teleologically oriented towards the soul and the intellect or spirit, I wanted to, so to speak, preview a little bit of what we're going to get to when we start understanding how how concepts like matter, or how accounts of things like matter, accounts of things like form are possible, and what their origin is.
Can I add one thing to that?
Oh, please do.
Yeah, just when you say they're not empirical, I think it's important to note that what we mean is they're not drawn from the particulars of experiences that we have that are mediated through sensation.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that. I sometimes use empirical without explaining it. Thank you.
So any experiences that we have, we take there to be changing things in our experiences, but it's not like the change itself is something that we can point to in our experience or take out of an object that we see or something like that.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Thank you. Clark, if you want to follow up anytime, please do. But in the meantime, I'm going to get to another couple questions. I got Brendan next.
I'm concurring with what you're saying. Like, I've actually been trying to write about what I think that philosophy is about. It's definitely about something that we call concepts, or like Aristotle was talking about, accounts. But I feel like there might be an unbridgeable gap between that we can't take in, that we can't necessarily explain, or that we can't get around just being given when it comes to the concepts that we employ and the world around us. For example, when I say change and I want to explain it to anyone, like a 7-year-old or just anyone who just wants to know basically what I mean, I'm going to use common sense language. But Aristotle's trying to get around that, in a sense, by employing many words which don't have to do necessarily with the commonsensical,
Right.
and have more to do with very, very broad, I guess, concept. He uses very broad concepts, but I don't think that this broad enough. I think that if you were more intelligent, if you were, very good at this, it would seem commonsensical. It would seem like common sense to you, in that those concepts, you would be able to keep in your mind all of these experiences, and you would still be referring to them always, no matter what you were talking about. And I don't understand how you might get away from that. I know that it's almost like a goal or a direction of philosophy to try and get away from that, but I don't know if it's ever going to be achieved.
Well, it's one of the most interesting things about concepts that we'll have to get to, is that once you've understood something, you can reformulate that understanding in innumerable ways. You can talk to 7-year-olds, you can talk to engineers, you can talk to all sorts of different audiences, you can talk to literary people, you can talk to, and you can explain those ideas in a different register each and every time. Right. So once you have the understanding, you're not tied to a particular language or a particular level of abstraction or something like that. And so I think that, what Aristotle is doing is, if you want to explain something to a child, well, you have to understand it first. And so you need a clear account of what it is that you're going to explain to children. You're definitely going to use different words, and you're going to create contexts in which are meaningful to children that are not necessarily meaningful to the philosopher or to the natural science. So I think that part of what's interesting about these concepts is their inexhaustible translatability into other terms. I mean, there's just no end to the different ways and examples and new contexts you can come up with in order to explicate an understanding of something. And that itself is very interesting, that they're all explications of one thing. But you have to understand, Aristotle is just very rigorous about formulating things tersely and precisely, so that you can get the proper understanding before you start trying to change it up and turn it into something.
Get the right one that he's talking about.
Yeah, exactly.
I guess it's that idea of one. That idea of it being one concept, as opposed, like, it almost seems like a fractal thing to me.
Right.
And
No, mhm.
I guess can I just add one more thing?
Yeah.
What was I gonna say? I think I'm gonna pass.
Okay,
But
yeah, well, then
basically is it was something about I was gonna bring up isomorphisms, how like, you know, isomorphism means seeing form. It's very Platonic if you translate it into English,
Uh.
but mathematically speaking, to have things being the same form, you can morph them between each other without by following certain rules. And
Yeah.
I feel like that's really the basis of what a concept or an account is.
Well, just
that I can grasp at this point.
right.
That's the
No,
one
that's
that
good.
I'm
That's
thinking.
good. We all got to start somewhere. Just keep testing it against what Aristotle's doing and see how your model works. That's a trial and error kind of thing. Anyway, thank you, Brendan. Let's see. I got the mad hippie next.
Fellas, how you doing?
Hey, how you doing?
Doing pretty well. Yeah, I was gonna do some other stuff, but then I saw, oh, philosophy. Okay, this will be good. You know, but you know, here's the thing, man, is that from my standpoint, the research that I've done, man, you know, I would say like abstractions is really just like basically claiming, you know, something. It's an idea. It's nothing really so much in physicality, you know, but then it's also the connotation of how you actually say the word. You know, like a word has several different meanings if you're meaning it in a different context. And so I think that
Sure.
I think that language is very important, you know, when it comes down to that. When
Right.
it comes down to logic, I mean, you know, you can take a look at Aristotle or Plato or Socrates or contemporary philosophers, and that's the thing though, is that you can use it as a good foundation, and a lot of it is still very pertinent and true today. But the thing is that they were living a long ass time ago.
Right.
and,
Right.
and so to take a look at today and what the hell is going on now, okay, and like what I would like to understand is the philosophy of fucking dogpiling and why people need to be like chiefs in the freaking douche canoe brigade like more often than not. That's what I want to fucking know.
Well,
You know, once we get there, those unbuildable bridges will become buildable.
That's a long way off, but I would like to understand that better too. So I appreciate the comment. Charlie, you're next.
Okay, couple of things. The way you described the idea of concept, and you'd like to call it determinations,
Right.
gave me, somehow in listening to you, gave me the impression that these things might have some existence on their own, that they might be, you know, you talked about them as being judges,
Right.
that they are the, I guess, what you'd call governing principles, or
Right.
governing, that nothing happens without these things being engaged. That's a first thing. Do you see them as being, for example, the matter, the form, or the nature, or the notion of motion that he talks about here as being engaged and governing, and they are actually kind of separate from what they're doing in a way? That's one thing. The second thing is, I was always under the impression that Aristotle was pretty firm on the fact that all knowledge begins in the senses, that it begins to come through the senses. And so it does have kind of, I guess in the very, very beginning, it does have an empirical basis, so to speak, or in that sense.
Right.
So
Right. I hear you, and I know that that's a very popular and a very historically influential way to understand Aristotle, and he does say things like that on occasion. So I'm not gonna deny that, right? But we can study that precisely in the concept of change, because he begins with what leading thinkers, those who think most about being, what they have to say about change and nature. And so there, and they are often basing their claims on something like empirical experience. But what's most salient here is that, Aristotle says we say things like something becomes something, right? Unmusical becomes musical, or the unmusical man becomes musical man, right? This is something that we can only know through experience, right? Right. And so, but that's experience, all, so to speak, already collected into a logos, collected into a linguistic expression. And then, thanks to Parmenides, we recognize that many of these logoi imply their contradictory opposite. And therefore, when you use them, when you talk about change this way, it turns out you're not talking about anything at all. So now we need reflection, and we need reflection, and we need, I will call it act of the intellect, to think through what change would have to be if it were not impossible. So we have indeed started with experience, but we're not abstracting anything from experience. Right? We are using experience as the basis for finding out whether there's whether experience and the language that expresses experience is a reliable tool for talking about what we want to talk about, namely change. It turns out it's not. Therefore, we develop an account of change. Once we've done that, we can turn back to our language and say, something becomes something, that's equivocal. Sometimes it hits change, sometimes it doesn't. But on the correct interpretation, something comes from something is a more adequate linguistic formulation of the concept of change. And interestingly enough, the linguistic formulation, something comes from something, itself reflects aspects of experience. But it's only when the linguistic expression is criticized and delimited according to the proper concept that the linguistic formulation can be used without contradiction, without equivocation, and actually be used knowingly to talk about change as it is and not change as something impossible. Does that make sense? That experience here is not some simple sense data that is pounding on our sense organs.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. That gives me a little better understanding of the importance and the basis, or how basic these concepts,
yes,
matter and form and things are.
Right.
And I can see where you're coming from in talking about these concepts. But Aaron, can you say that they have an existence on their own? Are they? That wouldn't be a proper.
No, that wouldn't be a proper. That wouldn't be a proper. No, but I mean, I use the expression they're necessarily possible. The concept of change is necessarily possible, and if there is anything that can be understood through that concept, that is existing change. Then we have existence. So the concept is the criterion not only for the thing, but the existence of the thing. Only if there's something only if reality rises to the concept can we say that change exists. But the concept is what determines that. And so it's, well, I hate to use a trite phrase, but it's kind of like Plato's idea of the good. They're beyond being. They're the grounds of existence, and they don't themselves exist. And anyway, yeah, I don't want to get too silly,
Okay.
but you can see what I'm saying.
Yes, I see what you're driving at. Yeah.
Excellent, right? I mean, so and it's precisely because of this mysterious nature of them that that the theologians of the early Latin period, right? I mean, they considered them to be the contents of the divine intellect, right?
Mhm.
And since that's prior to existence, that's prior to creation, right? Oh, thanks. So this, yeah, so this trope or this motif recurs over and over and over. You know, just that there must be something beyond existence for things to exist in the way they exist, and that's,
Yeah.
you know, divine intellect or our intellect or something like that.
Mhm.
All right, Phil, and then Peter, who's probably going to tell me to hurry up.
Yeah, so I want to try to get at better the point I made earlier. Like, I think there's a lot of threads in Greek thought and in our thought about the idea of the abstract or abstraction. So one would be sort of a verbal form, a process that happens over time. Michael, I think you correctly identified that as a process of subtraction, removing things in order to get at some sort of essence, whatever that might mean. Okay, so there's that, which is a process, and that sort of necessarily involves an intellectual agent of some sort, you know, a human or a god in the Greek context. But it also seems like there's another thread to the meaning of the abstract, which was active in Greek thought. And this is the idea not so much of subtraction, but of being removed from the everyday. So like a Platonic form would be removed from the stuff you see every day. It would be removed from the dangers of dying or of being damaged, for example. And I'm sure the Greeks used an enormous number of different specific words to get at these sort of aspects of the timeless or the removed from everyday life. But like something like the Pythagoreans would have an idea of entities that were not so much dependent on us. Like, I think a lot of your points about abstraction were getting at the way that we are the ones doing the abstracting. But I think there was another thread, most visible perhaps in the Pythagoreans, where these abstractions were sort of there independent of us in some sense. And if that is not present in Aristotle, it's because Aristotle is either actively arguing against it or actively trying to avoid it or something. Like, it's not like he was unaware of this other version of the abstract that was floating out there in Greek culture. So I'm just wondering what you might say about that.
Aristotle thematizes that actually frequently as he calls it what is separable. You've probably encountered that quite often in these texts, right? What is separable just means that it is not dependent on it's not dependent on a natural body, but like the mathematical line is separable, and therefore it has its own properties that are independent of any natural body that it happens to be, that happens to have a surface and therefore be composed of lines and that kind of thing. I think the idea of remote is takes us down a wrong path. But I mean, that's just, you know, I'm not, yeah, that's about as far as I can go with that.
Can I
Sorry,
add one thing?
I feel like I'm a little bit under time pressure. I apologize for that. But Philip, as you work out this thought and you see resonances in the Aristotelian text, please come back to it so we can have a more thorough conversation about it.
Yeah, like what I'm wondering is, like, it sounds like you would like to avoid that question about the other kind of abstract, the timeless, the part that's not dependent on us. And I think Aristotle also just sort of, oh, geez, I don't want to think about that. Like, I think Aristotle also wants to avoid it. But my question is, does he have an argument for avoiding it? Does he just find it, like, distasteful, or like, oh, that's what my teacher worried about. I don't want to think about that. I want to think about something new. Like, I'm just not clear how Aristotle manages to avoid that whole enormous thread that happened in Greek thought.
Right.
Yeah.
And you know, okay, two things. You're right to talk about it. I think it is misleading to use the term abstract to talk about ideas, or which is to say, talk about the substance or talk about the reality of a thing. The reality of a thing is not abstract. It is the living, pulsing pulsating nature of the thing that is the idea, or is the form, it is the actuality. And so there's nothing remote about them, and there's nothing otherworldly, and there's nothing far away about them. It's just that if you are used to thinking about things by thinking exclusively about what the senses give you, then it seems like they're quite far away. But the problem is that you will never understand the reality of anything if you stay focused on what your senses give you. And so you have to turn your thought around away from the sense contents to their proper accounts, to their ideal contents. And that's not, and so I'm just, what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to put a stumbling block in front of people who want to talk about thought and concepts and the rest of it in linguistic terms of abstraction. Peter.
I was just going to make a quick response to Charlie's question about doesn't Aristotle, think knowledge starts from the senses, was roughly where Charlie started with. And that always reminds me of that section in posterior analytics where he says, that we perceive the individual, but perception is of the universal. So while we always start with the particulars as kind of the occasion of our knowledge, right? The knowledge isn't tied up in the individual particular things, but it's always that universal that allows us to even have knowledge of anything. There is no being without the universal. But the occasion for all these things are these particulars and individuals.
I like that because the whole problem is all our knowledge starts in our senses, assumes that the senses are some kind of separate, completely separate set of faculties from thought. And then somehow thought has to come to the senses from the outside and start synthesizing or working under the hood or something like that, which I think is just a very, very false notion of what knowledge is. And I like Peter's point because you can't think about perception without perception being, what does he say? You perceive is the particular, but
perception is of the universal. You perceive the individual, but the perception is of the universal.
Exactly. And so the universal or thought or whatever is not independent of perception. I think that's a very helpful
Good,
indicator.
thank you.
Clark and then Sandy.
Yep. Sorry.
Hey, it's all good.
Let's see here. Wow, there's just so much here. Really interesting, Peter, bringing that up that way. I feel kind of scared about all this because I'm not grokking it enough to feel like I'm really understanding it to the point that I'm not going to have to be forced to believe it. Continue on with Aristotle.
Don't do that.
And I know that would be breaking the rules.
Exactly.
Because the whole point that I'm doing this is I've lived much of my life on the basis of belief, and I can't see that that we're all thriving because of it. In some ways, yes, but in other ways, no. So the universal is not independent of the particular. We're going back to basic formulations. And I don't see how there's not the engagement of our linguistic set that creates what we do up here or in here or whatever, however you want to conceive of it. That is not something that has been, that is not in a projection of some sort. And if there's some claim that's being made that there's not a projection of some sort that's coming out of my linguistic frame, on what basis can that be made except by belief? I don't see the connections that are being argued here exactly. And I totally believe it's very likely I just simply have skated over it because of my lack of training, but I'm getting better. But I can't see it yet. I can't see it yet. I don't see it. And I just want to let you know. And the other thing is who can I read so I don't hold everybody else down if everybody else is following you? I need something that specifically relates to what you're talking about today.
Okay.
So if you have any resources, I'm happy to hear of them.
Okay,
Yep,
yeah,
thank
cool. Cool. Charlie, you indicated like maybe you want to say something.
I just wanted to say very briefly to Clark, Aristotle, I think, at least the way I've learned him, is saying things here that are so basic and has put his finger on what I would say the way things are so basically and so fundamentally that it's a challenge to think of something better. And if you think you have to believe this, or if you think it's not quite adequate or something or else, then it's up to you to come up with something better. And I don't know, I'll say this, I don't know if it's worth saying, but I'll say it. Of all the philosophers and philosophies that I have throughout the years come into contact with, I have not found anything as adequate as Aristotle.
Mm.
So that's where I am with Aristotle. And I just think with Aristotle, you kind of have to be there. That Aristotle is laying out a basis that beyond which you really can't go in a way.
Right.
And so if you if you feel yourself that you're believing it or something, well, check out another philosopher or come up with something on your own or something of that sort.
Well, can I just pipe in? Oh, I just pipe in real
That's
quick.
all.
The alternative that is constantly over me, like a sort of democracy, sort of whoever, what's his name? Democles. Yeah, is that we simply don't know, and human beings simply do not understand where they came from, what is going on, and what this whole experience is like. That's the alternative. It's not that you can believe something, you can go with Aristotle. I think there's a third alternative, and that is humility, that we do not know. And there's a great account that could measure that, and that is saying, well, if you don't know, how is anything what are you doing? How are you making decisions? That I think account can be made, but of course it's not going to be as strong as something like Aristotle that I don't understand yet, but not as strong as belief. Let me just put it that way. Thanks.
No, that's awesome, guys. I just Clark, continue to not believe, continue to strive to comprehend, and I guarantee you that almost nobody here really knows what I'm talking about. So you're in good company. But it's part. It's one of those things that I want to convey in this Aristotle seminar and the other Aristotle seminar. I got a couple of hands here, but okay. But the last thing I'm going to say to your question is we are starting a group in a couple of weeks that's going to piggyback on this. That's going to be that reading that you asked for, and written by a contemporary, and then you can engage that in a way that I think will shed a lot of light on what I'm doing in Aristotle, and I think Aristotle himself is doing. So,
and that would be the Schmidt
Thank
book.
you.
That would be the Schmidt book, right?
And that's why, Clark, maybe we're mildly less lost than you are. But
Thank you.
Excellent, Sandy. Thank you incredibly, everybody, for your patience. Sandy, go ahead.
I just want to make sure that I'm understanding how we brought up abstraction in the first place, because it didn't come up in the reading, so I got a little annoyed actually when you brought it up.
Yeah,
I'm like, not another word, God, that I barely understand. But okay, so so I want to try to understand. Obviously, you arrived at it somehow, and
right.
Is it through Parmenides then? Is it related to this Parmenides idea and change? And because I understand that you're saying that abstraction is like a modern, or that's just our, what did you say at the beginning? We're just kind of like, that's just our given, like we just assume.
A cultural DNA. We always just think about
cultural DNA. Okay. Right. And that's us, like as modern people, and or is Aristotle, or would you say that Aristotle might make the argument that if you just go off a Parmenidean understanding of the world, all you will wind up with is abstractions and you
No.
won't. No. Okay.
No.
I'm trying to figure out how it relates and like how that's what I want. That's what I want to get at.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the shortest story I can tell is this. If thought is abstraction, it's abstracted from something. What's it abstracted from? It's abstracted from perceptions. Therefore, all thought is tied to perceptions. What Aristotle is talking about is not given in perceptions. Therefore, Aristotle is making things up.
Okay, and whose argument would that be then? Just somebody who didn't like Aristotle.
99% of the people read the Greeks.
Okay. And so this is kind of an aside then to what Aristotle is actually saying. It's not.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
No.
All right. I was just trying to understand that because I was getting a little confused because I wasn't sure if this was something that he was addressing directly or not in his writings. So
no, that's fair enough, and you should probably. So what I want to do is on our reading days, I want to read. We didn't do that yet, but we'll read now. And then on our off days, we'll open things up for these kind of conversations to go at as long as you want, really. So I want to have that. I want to do my best to introduce that division of labor. But since today we're starting up the new semester, and rather than I wanted to put my finger on a point that's just very near and dear to my heart, that we're not going to understand Aristotle if we think of thought as abstraction. And so I've been trying to work out what's going on in his text, which is the formation of an account or a concept that cannot be conceived as abstraction. And so I want to put my finger on that and get you to be very attentive to it and what's going on there and why it's not an abstraction and why it's powerful and all the rest. But you're right, it was not in our reading today.
okay, I'm just trying to follow. I'm just.
You're a brave woman, Sandy. It's not always easy. Tyler.
And is that the last remark? We can move on.
We got Tyler.
Yeah, Tyler's last remark. Tyler gets the last word.
Tyler gets the last word, if he's still with us.
Yeah, I think one thing to note here is that, so if you take just one day of life, you're going to recognize changes across your day, and another, you're still going to recognize changes, but they're changes in different contents. So change cannot be abstracted from the particular contents if it spans all of these different contents. And so it's not something that is separate from your life, because change occurs within it. The change occurs within these events, right? But it's not abstracted from them as particular events. Secondly, when we understand change, we may need expressions or understanding of the content that change is, but the names or way of referencing or expressing that content are not the content itself.
Yeah.
So it's not merely language, and it's not abstracted from particulars of daily life. I think we can rule both of those out for that reason.
All right. And I think that's very good. And I think that's a good recommendation for Clark. And just acknowledge that we don't have abstraction going on here. And then don't try to explain it. Don't try to get a bunch of theories together to explain it. Don't try to explain it, right? Let's dwell in it a little bit and explore it before we come with a quick and easy or a very extensive explanation of it. You know, how did it come about? Yeah, that's a good question. How did it come about? But it's not what Aristotle's after. So we'll have to table that. But what we can do is spend quite a bit of time exploring the consequences and exactly, getting a better understanding of it. So what we need to do is understand. You don't need to believe anything. You just need to understand, and we're going to spend a lot more time understanding these strange things called accounts. Anyway, that's just my recommendation. Okay, so let's read, and then any final announcements I'll make at the end. We've already had a very productive hour, at least I think so. All right, who's going to share screen for the text? So
I have to leave in like 20 minutes, so I shouldn't probably be the one doing it.
okay. Do you have to shut your computer down?
I have to repurpose it.
Okay.
What page on physics do we go to?
So we're in physics. Let's read page 20, book 2, chapter 1.
Good. Page 20, hold on.
That's page 71 of the PDF.
Wow.
Okay, there we
There
are.
it is. Thanks. All right, let's get at what Aristotle has to say about nature and flesh it out a little bit. So I'll just start reading here. Of beings, some are by nature, while others are due to other causes. Those that are by nature are animals and their parts, plants and simple bodies, for example, earth, fire, air, and water, for we say these and things like them are by nature. All these things evidently differ from things that are not composed by nature, for each of them has within itself a starting point of moving and being at rest, some with respect to place, some with respect to increase and decrease, others with respect to alteration. A bed, by contrast, or a cloak, or anything else of that kind, insofar as each such predicate applies to it, that is, to the extent it is a product of craft, has no innate impulse to change. But insofar as it is coincidentally made of stone, earth, or a mixture of the two, to that very extent, it does have one. This is because nature is a sort of starting point and cause of moving and being at rest in that to which it belongs primarily, intrinsically, and not coincidentally. I'm going to stop there. I do want to get into the doctor thing, but I want to stop there. Peter.
I was just going to say, there's like so much to comment even on that first sentence that I didn't know if you were just opening up for comments now or you wanted to.
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So he's obviously setting up a contrast, and we want to talk about that contrast, right? Some are by nature, others are due to other causes. What are the others he gives us? Right. The examples: bed or cloak, products of craft. All right. So let's open it up. What is the difference between that which is by nature and that which is by craft? And then later we'll get into the whole coincidentally thing, because that's always a little tricky. Right, here we have, so to speak, the nature and art being opened up and opposed to one another for the first time in a systematic manner. So obviously this is going to have long, considerable consequences historically, this particular distinction. So Peter, do you want to make the first comments?
Sure. So
Awesome.
Obviously the first sentence says, some things are by nature. So not everything is by nature. For instance, I don't think a rock has any nature to it. And so what are these things that have nature? After the parentheses, it says, all these things evidently differ from things that are not composed by nature.
Right.
For each of them has within itself a starting point of moving and being at rest.
Mm-hmm.
So there's something intrinsic, something inside the thing that gives it a nature. And
Right.
that nature has to do with of moving and being at rest. So it's somehow going to deal with change or motion, or not motion just in location, but in the broader sense that Aristotle's been talking about motion. Really kind of a motion of changing color from leaves or your blossom turning into the fruit, et cetera, all that kind of stuff. Anyway, so it's an internal principle of things. That's not enough to start with, I think.
Oh, absolutely. I'm glad you brought up the internal. So let's explore that to the extent to which we have an understanding of that. Phil.
I sort of argued myself out of my point while I was waiting, but let me sort of do it anyway. Michael, I think an underlying thesis you're trying to get across is that the Greeks thought very differently from we do, and we should always be on the lookout for that. And one aspect of this is, I'm using a different translation, unfortunately. I plan to get the Reeve at some point. But so in my translation, it says, insofar as they are products of art, they have no innate impulse to change.
Right.
And I thought that was kind of extraordinary, because we tend to associate the natural world with sort of a timeless state, or slower, calmer, and we tend to associate the products of art or techne with a fast-paced, constant, frenzied sort of change. And I just thought that was quite extraordinary, not in any deep way, but just in sort of like the connotations or the overall impression that he would associate the products of art or techne with non-change. That just seemed kind of extraordinary to me.
Excellent. No, that's very, very interesting. That's a great observation. And it is precisely the inverse of what we tend to, how we tend to think of these things. Appreciate that. All right, like Peter said, there's a lot in here. So let's hit whatever is interesting to you or quizzical to you. Please feel free to ask questions. Clark.
So he's contrasting a cloak, a bed, with something, with a body by nature.
Right.
And the distinction, one of the distinctions he's making, which you've already mentioned, is that there's an innate impulse to change. That is a property of these bodies of nature.
Yep.
And so if I leave my cloak out, outside, it is going to change. And he's not going to, now you could say that it's why is it changing? Isn't there an intrinsic property to a cloak made of yarn that fades in the sunlight? Or a bed made out of wood that rots?
Yeah.
Isn't there some intrinsic something there? So that's one of my questions. I got a lot of questions in this passage.
Oh, no, that's good. No, but I think he actually even answers that in this very paragraph. Does anybody have an answer to that for Clark?
Well, its principle is what it does for someone else that's outside of it.
Yeah, but so Clark's question is, doesn't a cloak change, right? And here's one of those opportunities to start making fine distinctions that Aristotle is so good at and teaches us, right? Anybody want to take a stab at it?
Well, he says it's by coincidence that things like that change.
Right.
They don't, the yarn isn't fading and deteriorating of its own principle.
Right.
As it were.
Well, but why is that? Could you just push that forward? I thought of that and I read what he said, but that doesn't seem to make sense about the material composition of things, because it's the nature of the material on how it's susceptible to the outside elements. And there's an interaction, in other words, between the outside and the inside.
Right.
And why does that suddenly stop with a cloak or a bed? It doesn't seem, what's the point there?
Sandy, you want to jump in?
I was gonna say, doesn't it just stop being a cloak at some point? Is that really change? Like, you would just say it's a busted cloak or a tattered cloak. Wouldn't you just define it negatively at that point? And then if it got to deteriorate really badly, then it would just deteriorate into the materials that it's made out of.
Right.
Right. And then those would just turn to dust, basically.
Right.
So,
oh, go ahead. Sorry.
No, no, I'm done.
Okay, so Aristotle says right after Peter's highlighted passage there, but insofar as a bed is coincidentally made of stone, earth, or a mixture of the two, to that extent, it does have an innate principle to change. All right. So what's he asserting there? He's asserting that artifacts are made up of both the art of the craftsperson and the materials that are put together, right? Like the leather in the shoe, and the materials themselves are going to have are going to have things that change by nature in them. So if a shoe is made of leather, the leather is going to have something in it, earth or fire or one of the elements that has its own innate impulse to change. And so that's why the bed will change if we plant it in the ground. But it won't change because it's a bed. It will change because it's wood or stone. And the principles that account for the movement of wood or stone will also account for the movement of the bed. All right. So artifacts are also made up of, artifacts are not natural, but one of the things they're made up of are natural things or natural beings. And only to the extent that they have something natural in them will they have the innate impulse to change. They will change. So does that answer your question, or does that yield a follow-up question, Clark?
No, that doesn't answer the question, because the things, the bodies, I mean, when he says of bodies that are composed by nature,
Right.
bodies that are composed by nature have the earth, have the fire in it.
Right.
Because it has a nature, and that's how he's defining it. So, but a cloak is, if it does change, it's because it shares in having the stone and the earth and the mixture of those.
Right.
There's no distinction there. I don't see the distinction.
There is, though.
In what way?
So it's the word quay. The cloak, quay cloak, isn't about any nature that the material brings with it. Is the nature of the material, not of the cloak. The cloak isn't reduced to simply a pile of yarn or something like that. The cloak, quay cloak, did not have its own nature. That was a nature that came from an artisan, the craftsman.
Right.
It's
so
just
right. So the candle will melt, not because it's a candle, but because it's wax. And wax has the property of melting. The candle is just a particular artfully formed piece of wax. And so it's the wax that is natural and allows for the candle to change in certain characteristic ways. Not in what ways? Not in the ways of a candle, but in the ways of wax. And so if, let's say, wax is made up of air and water, then it's going to change in the ways that are characteristics of air and water, and not in the ways of fire and earth, because those are not part of its composition. So the ways it's changed, so the kind of changes it's capable of are determined by the kinds of natures that it's composed of. Tyler, and then Sandy.
Yeah, I was just going to add that something can be made of one material or another and change in different ways due to its material, but not due to what it is as an artifact.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that aligns neatly with Aristotle, and we can see examples that make that fairly easy. So a bed made of wood is going to change in different ways than a bed made of stone or something else.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And none of those changes are the changes of the bed just taken as bed. Well, here to use that word, abstracting from the material that it's made out of. The changes, insofar as they're natural changes, the wood will decay. That's natural. Now, of course, it can also change if somebody comes in and tears it apart, but that's an external force being exercised on the wood. And so the change doesn't come from the nature of the wood. The change comes only from the external force imposed on it. So that's the real distinction we're getting at here that Peter pointed out at the very beginning, right? What is an internal principle of change, and how does that contrast with an external principle of change? That's what we're trying to grok here. So let me see, Tyler, you still got your hand up. Did you want to add something? You're welcome
no, I
to.
just left it up because I forgot Peter was gone. I guess you could say what it is that makes it a bad has to be responsible for the change, for it to be the kind of change Aristotle's talking about. But of course, in this case, it's change in the case of the changes of the material or the changes of something outside coming in and changing it cannot be its own nature being responsible for the change.
Right. Right. And so, yeah, no, that's good. And the other thing is one of the things that Aristotle's most anxious to understand is order, taxis, the Greek word taxis, the order of things, right? And there's no order to all the different kinds of external force and violence you can do to things, right? But there is an order to change. And we begin getting at that order not by thinking about changes as only external, but also including in our picture an idea of internal change, which is why wood doesn't spontaneously combust or melt into water, but decays because of its natural principle of change. Okay, Sandy, Philip, and Clark.
He seems to be making a connection here between the no innate impulse to change and the product of craft. So
yes,
this is because the product of craft it has an end, I guess. There's a moment when it stops coming into being. It just is what it was supposed to be, right? And the idea that it would then change would mean that it is no longer, you know what I mean? Like is he trying to make a distinction here between like a natural thing, which is maybe alive and is changing or whatever, and then something that's man-made, which has this end goal where, you know, at some point it becomes this thing and then you stop. And then it's just maybe a maintenance issue, right? Of making sure that it doesn't fall down like a bridge, hopefully, that you're going to be driving over every day or something.
I think what he has in mind is that statues don't build themselves, but living organisms do. And cosmos reestablishes over and over again an orderly, harmonious working of all its parts, but shoes don't. Shoes don't put themselves together. Statues don't. Houses don't. All these things that are products of craft, products of techne. Right? What makes them change is something external to them, namely the builder or the craftsperson, right? And he's contrasting that with things that somehow do change by their own nature and not by some external force. I think that's the salient thing he's looking at, because he does say, some things, reach an end and then they rest, and other things never reach an end, but their end is their continuous motion, like the revolution of the stars and through the heavens. Right? So some natural things have an end where they stop, and other natural things don't. So I don't think that's the salient, what he's most focused on here.
Okay, I find it really fascinating, from a point of like aesthetics point of view, because
cool.
For example, when I was learning about the history of Mexico, there was these, there was Cortez and Mendoza. There was this exchange, between the native king and then the Spanish explorers. And there was apparently, he gave them, Mendoza gave Cortez these gold discs that were, I don't really understand what they were. I guess we don't know what their purpose was. It was an artifact though, and it had, elaborate engravings of, their language or their calendar on it or whatever. And Cortez didn't recognize that this had any value outside of the gold that it was worth. So he melted it down. And this really makes all of the anthropologists and historians and archaeologists really angry, that he didn't understand that this was an object of craft. It wasn't just a gold doubloon that he could go and use, for whatever purpose. So, it's interesting. So there is some kind of relationship also between, even though the product of craft is made of material, there's this idea that's informing it in order to exist, right? It's because you don't go out and just find a bed in nature. You don't just go find a cloak. You can't just throw a bunch of wool together and right?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And just, he's noticing this is like a qualitative, right, thing that he notices. Some things change in an orderly way, and other things, the order of the change is man-made, or otherwise the changes are disorderly, right? And so that's, so to speak, the phenomenological, if you want to say, the experiential basis for this initial distinction that he wants to explore in all of its logical ramifications, right? But he's just opening up the field here. Philip, then Clark, then Brendan.
Oh, I didn't actually request to speak, but I should mention that because I'm calling in on a landline, I don't have a way to lower my hand. You have to do that at your end, or it doesn't get done. Sorry.
Oh, okay, that's all good. But okay, that's good to know. But we got the Philip York as well.
Oh,
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks, Michael. So I have a couple of items. One is I'm thinking about these borderline cases, and I think one is like Frankenstein's monster, where Frankenstein's monster begin as due to other causes and then somehow become by nature, which we're quite fascinated by, the homunculus and Faust and our ongoing attempts to do this. And I'm thinking about Rumpelstiltskin. So the trade in Rumpelstiltskin. So Rumpelstiltskin gives the woman the ability to turn straw into gold. So he gives her craft, and in return he receives nature, right? He wants the child. So it's just like right across that border right there is that transition occurring there. And then I'm thinking about we use the term knee replacement. They say if someone got a knee replacement. So what that means is we take a knee, and a knee has an innate impulse to change, and an innate impulse to actually modify itself and take care of itself. And we put a piece of titanium that doesn't. I mean, it's very useful, but it's not a knee. So we're not replacing the knee. We're substituting the knee, but we don't use that language. It's interesting. We say replacement as if, well, it's not a knee. I mean, do we really think that's a knee? And I think in a certain sense, we do think that's a knee, which is like such a mistake.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah. We do think it's a knee, right? That's very peculiar and very interesting observation. Totally.
So the last thing is that we have these, I'm thinking about the modern turn. So we think of, kind of going from Vico, let's say, to Marx. We think of systems as natural now. So we think of political systems, economic systems as natural because precisely for the Aristotelian definition, we think, oh, they have an innate impulse to change. Therefore, they must be natural. Therefore, they must have laws that can be used to describe things that are natural. It's just interesting to see where that that's a. I mean, it looks like, oh yeah, but it's an enormous leap. I mean, so I think unlike systems, we both treat them as natural and we treat them as objects of craft, i.e. they're perfectible and can be made. Okay, that's all I got.
No, but there is something interesting about that insofar as these systems have mechanisms that restore fundamental equilibriums without anybody intending that. And I think that probably is something that Aristotle would take very, very seriously as, a manifestation of nature. It's a super interesting parallel. But of course, this analogy, we'd have to explore, what's disanalogous there, and whether what's disanalogous is essential or not, to figure out whether we're entitled to talk about those as living in the same way that he thinks of the cosmos as somehow alive, and also plants and animals. Clark.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if I can get this out, but if I was walking in the woods,
Yeah.
and I've done a lot of backpacking. So I'm walking in the woods, I see a bed of leaves. I see a bed of sand. It's my imagination. It's my experience, my well, it's my imagination that makes it so. I call it a bed. It's a pile of sand.
Right.
I see some limbs and I put leaves on it. It's a bed. So I'm just not buying that there's, well, I don't want to say it that way. I'm not understanding this strict distinction between the inner and the outer movement. It seems to me to be a function of the term that you're using to call it. And that's what makes it so. And so I've read up on a little bit on nominalism. I knew nothing about it. And after reading just a small bit, I go, oh my God, I'm a nominalist.
Yeah.
I'm a nominalist, but there's so many different types of nominalists and all that. I'm not sure what type I am, but I'm not even sure I am. But I'm just saying, I keep going back to the fact that who gives the term cloak or bed to it? And you're saying the inputs make it so, make it the artifact.
Right.
I think it's more complicated than that. It has a lot to do with the word used to call it, and the word is making it so, and that's nominalism, isn't it?
Well, yeah. I think you need to slow down.
All right.
Can I?
I'm sure I do.
So all we're noticing is that some things change without, and they change in characteristic ways, and other things don't change in characteristic ways, but to the extent to which they come to be through the product of craft. Really, that's all he has in mind here. So he's pointing it out, and you're right. He doesn't justify it yet. He's going to give examples and flesh this out. But at this point right here, he's just putting his finger on, getting us to notice a distinction, right, between what I just described. And so, right, okay, Brendan.
All right, is my audio okay? I'm on my phone.
Yes.
Okay, let's see if I can remember. Okay, so basically, I was just thinking about how binary this account of the way that change is in the world, the distinction between natural things which seem to change without any input, and artifacts which change. Well, actually, I guess maybe my input should be a question. How is it that we're relating artifacts to change? I don't actually. Do you think you could clarify that really quick?
The short answer that hopefully is enough is artifacts don't come to be through themselves. They come to be through an external source of movement. So they don't move them. They don't move themselves into the form that they they result in. But certain things do. Certain things do that, and that's the difference that he's interested in. Right? What's going on here? What is it when somebody says why does that happen, and we say, well, it's natural, right? What is it what's the comprehension that lies contained in that observation? Right.
So it's almost as if artifacts contain within them an explanation for their change, or not within them necessarily, but they have to do. They have an explanation which we can talk about for their change, whereas natural things just like, boom, it changed because that's its nature. Is it kind of like that?
Well, not quite, because he's not saying, well, all you have to do is call something natural and you understand why it changes the way it changes. But when we call something natural, it is because part of the explanation of why it changes the way it changes will be an appeal to an internal principle, right? So, and that's not the whole explanation, but it's a necessary part of the explanation. And that is not true of artifacts. And so Aristotle's just got this distinction in view. And he's not saying all things are either one or the other, right? That remains to be seen. What he's after at this point is, how do we think about this difference right here? Sandy.
Okay.
Oh, I just wanted to respond to Philip. I really loved him bringing up the knee replacement thing.
Oh, cool.
And I think it has something to do with their denial of death personally, but I just know that when I got my first dental crown, I came home and I said to my husband, it's the first part of me that died. And it's like the crown, I didn't recognize it as being part of me, it was like, of course you have to trick yourself into thinking that though, in order to go on, right? So maybe that's what we do with knee replacements as well. I just love that Philip brought that up.
Well, but it is great the way in which, we're very unclear. We don't have a clear criterion between what's natural and what's artificial. And so since the boundary is blurry, we call some artificial things natural and some natural things artificial. And we find ourselves equivocating right and left. Yeah, we're confused. So I think that's a brilliant example to show exactly how that kind of linguistic practice exhibits a categorical confusion. Richard. Lamb, you had your hand up. You change your mind?
Yeah, I'm just trying to see if I'm understanding. Because so Aristotle is just, and like I see, like looking at the text again, like that. So maybe I'm kind of translating into like, using some modern terminology, but hopefully kind of keeping in the spirit of kind of Aristotle's way of thinking, because some of the phrasings, it can just easily get lost in kind of, a word salad, but like,
right.
He's just differentiating between like change that happens through some sort of intrinsic force, like in the case of like, some of the examples we talked about, like kind of a material cause, of what it's made from. And then, kind of in our modern science understanding, it's like, it's like molecularly, atomically, like those reactions are happening to reach greater stability, right? Whereas things that, where its form is undone, there's an efficient cause, and it's acted upon externally, like extrinsically. Is that kind of summing up what we're discussing?
No, I think so. That seems to me to map on very well. Right. If you accelerate atoms in an atomic accelerator, we add the external cause of motion, but what happens after that is not our doing. Right. That's a product of the nature that is inherent in the subatomic particles that are colliding. And that's why they're informative, right? If we designed the outcome of the experiment, it wouldn't be informative. So
actually, when you're using informative, is there a particular Aristotelian meaning that you're inferring from that, or?
No.
Okay.
I just want to say
kind of in our modern usage.
Okay. Yeah, exactly. Okay. That tells us something new, or confirms our hypotheses or whatever. Tristan.
I have a question about the beings that are by nature. So we've been talking a lot about ones like artifacts, so ones that are coincidentally or could have a coincidental nature in them. So with ones that are by nature, would it be jumping ahead too much, or would this even be related? I'm guessing it'd be related, but I just don't know how. But the final cause, does that, for sake of which, would that have anything to do with why they're able to be like self-starting points, self-starters? I'm just wondering, maybe I just started to think about that a little bit, but excellent. I guess my broader question is why, I don't remember if we went over this in the past, but why where does that inner starting point, that self starting point come from, I guess, with nature, beings that are by nature?
Right. Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that. And I don't think that, well, I'm not quite sure if Aristotle speculates too much on where they come from. He pays very close attention to the fact that some beings are natural because they have this self-relation, and other beings are not. And he's going to flesh that out and draw, just like with change, we ultimately got to an examination of some aspects of matter and form and lack and possibility and actuality, right? So this will lead to further explorations of these primary concepts. And often Aristotle is going to make the argument that certain things are eternal. And so therefore, yeah, Tom, you're right, it's soul, but there's only so many times I can do previews. Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Sorry, I just lost my train of thought. Did you sense where I was going?
Yeah, I think.
Oh, right. So my point was that for instance, the number and kind of forms and the world itself, these are eternal, and so you have to understand some logical relations to understand that they can't have come to be. There can't be a point in time in which they were not. Right? And once you have that recognition, then you recognize that where did they come from is a nonsensical question. And indeed, I think that I think it's true to say that anything that has a self-relation is going to have an aspect of eternity to it. And to ask where does it come from is to misunderstand the kind of thing you're confronted with. And so, so I just wanted to open up the possibility to you that maybe where does it come from is not always the right question.
Okay, I'm still a little confused. I don't know why I'm confused, but the feeling is there.
Okay.
I'm willing to just follow along the text further though and just see where he goes with this. So.
Okay. Just jump in anytime you want to pursue the question, because it's a very, very interesting one. And we haven't really hit any of the eternity arguments too much of what's eternal and what's not in Aristotle. We'll hit more of that in the metaphysics, but also in the later books of the physics. But what I do want to say is that it is, so to speak, a modern habit to think that everything is capable of a narrative where from where it wasn't to where it was incipient to then where it is actualized. And obviously, if you try to do that, for instance, with time, you're going to run into all sorts of contradictions. And if you try to do that with space and other and perhaps even thought itself or energy, where did energy come from? So we recognize that some things do not permit of that kind of question, or if we ask that kind of question, we're implicitly we're asking for an answer that amounts to a miracle, right? Well, it just happened. That's the sign that we might be dealing with something that time can have a temporal origin, and once we try to give time a temporal origin, we end up in all sorts of logical contradictions, and that at least is a clue that we need to begin to look at, what speaks at least for the eternity of time, and therefore, some things in time that would be temporal and all the rest of it. Anyway, I hope that was helpful. If it's not, then whenever the question pops up in the text, please jump up and answer it, Tristan. Richard, and then Phil.
I think relating to your response to Tristan's question about why asking where did it come from for some things doesn't really have meaning. I was just reviewing the text again to see whether the text around it elaborated, but I don't think he's really going there yet. But I guess there is one example that's in there which I think maybe applies, which is say his bringing up in chapter 3, in the beginning of chapter 3, the musical relationship of the octave, like the 2-to-1 ratio,
yeah.
which is kind of eternal, right?
Right. Yeah, that's another thing in numbers. Numbers, where'd they come from? Any account of them will imply the either the discrete or continuous nature of them, and you're ended up in these kind of contradictions that Kant called antinomies. When you try to think of the beginning of something that can't meaningfully be thought of as having a beginning, you end up in antinomies. Awesome, thank you. Philip York. Oh, no, sorry, the other Philip.
Yep.
Canadian Philip.
Okay, so I don't have the Reeve translation, so I'm just going to read from Becker number 15.
Cool.
On the other hand, a bed and a coat and anything else of that sort, qua receiving these designations.
Right.
Now that turn of phrase seems odd to me. I don't know how it is in the Reeve, but receiving these designations suggests to me that in Aristotle's mind, there's a link between naming a bed and a coat and designing a bed and a coat. So the act of the person who correctly identifies, hey, that's a bed, hey, that's a coat, and the person who designed the bed and the coat. Now, this is going to be a bit of a stretch, but you were asking about eternity. And like when we think about designing a bed and coat, we've lived after the Industrial Revolution. We tend to think of a design as an abstract pattern. We tend to think of beds and coats as things that could be mechanically reproduced. I mean, even if all humans died, we could imagine a factory that continued building beds and coats. But I imagine for Aristotle, I don't know this, but I imagine like the design aspect would not be quite so abstract. It would be more embodied knowledge, or knowledge that was in a human, or maybe a set of humans, like some sort of school of bed makers or school of coat makers. And so I'm just wondering about this link between naming the thing and designing or constructing the thing.
Interesting. No, I'm not sure I have a very helpful answer to that, because the way I understood this passage is but a bed, but the Reeve says a bed by contrast, or a cloak, or anything else of that kind, insofar as each such predicate applies to it, right? And then he explicates that. That is, to the extent that it is a product of craft. And so I hear him saying, of anything that a relevant predicate stemming from the domain of techne, if it's applicable to the thing, then it's a product of craft, and then it will not have its own inner principle of change. And so so the naming thing just kind of drops out for me there. Do you want to follow up on that, or?
Yeah. Okay. So Reeve is going with more of a predication than. Yeah. Okay. And how about the aspect of my question where it's awfully tempting for us to think of the design of a bed and coat, as something abstract, something that's, mechanically reproducible, something that could be connected to infinity, in the sense that design could be, like in a sense, the design is abstracted from the material world, in the sense that I could design a bed and then one person could build it out of cherry wood, another out of beech wood, another out of plaster of Paris. Like the design could have an abstraction from its material element. And yet, I feel pretty confident that Aristotle wouldn't have thought about the design that way. He probably would have thought about it as something that was knowledge that a human had, or a school of design would have, something like that.
No, I think you're right, and I think that if we design a mechanical process to reproduce a certain form, right, we have to have that form in our head, so to speak, or we have to have the idea of the form in order to get the machines to work right. And so in that sense, it just reproduces Aristotle's original insight that the form of the bed doesn't come from the wood, it doesn't come from the motion, but the wood and the motion are organized according to a form such that the end product is a bed, and that form is not in the matter and it's not in the motion, it is in the builder. And that's different from natural things where the form is not in the human being. It is in the way in which natural beings actualize their innate principles of change. They don't need a builder. Artifacts do. Brendan, you had a question. Do you want to wait it for it, or was it already answered?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to add on to that, my own thoughts that I've been having about sort of, I was trying to think, is there a philosophy of like engineering or art, but mostly engineering because I'm an engineer. But I was thinking about it after reading the Aristotle about in the second section. I don't think we're there yet. But no. He was talking exactly about what you guys were just talking about, where the knowledge of the end is involved in the change of something from nature into artifacts.
Right.
And I just wanted to like posit the idea that when you're engineering, when you're trying to make any kind of artifact, you have that knowledge in your head, but you're utilizing the tools of sort of intuitive decision making about which sorts of forms the thing should have for the end, and also knowledge, scientific knowledge of what sort of nature that thing will have, the form that you. Exactly. I don't know about nature, but that's exactly what you were talking about. So I just wanted to add that.
And that's why he says, somewhere he says, if craft imitates nature, and that's exactly what we're doing. We are acting towards an end, which is form in our shoes and in our statues, which nature already has, so to speak, and things that are natural already have in themselves. So that's why art imitates nature. Art not in the aesthetic sense, but in the sense of techne, of producing something, manufacturing something. All right, 5:45. Let's see. I think I'm going to take up the whole doctor thing being coincidentally the cause of health next time. So because it gets a little bit into the weeds, but Aristotle uses coincidental a lot, which in Greek is the kata symbebikos, right? Just often translated as accidentally or as an accident or a property of something, but not intrinsically. And so kind of getting a handle on that is and practicing how practicing thinking through how he uses that is very helpful for opening up these texts. Let me see. Let's just read a little bit more. He's going to get to the discussion of whether matter or form is more fundamental in natural beings. All right, and but before we get there, let's just read kind of his conclusion here, and then if it adds more, let's talk about it, and if it doesn't, we can go on. So same page, starting with paragraph, similarly to with other things that are produced, for none of them has within itself the starting point of its own production. But in some cases, such as a house and each of the other products of handicraft, the starting point is in something else and external. Whereas in others, those that may be coincidental causes to themselves, that's the doctor, the starting point is in the thing, but not intrinsically. Okay, so there we're getting at coincidental versus intrinsic. We can broach that today, but we'll have to finish it next time. Reading on, nature then is what has been stated, and the things that have this sort of starting point have a nature, have an intrinsic being, and each of them is a substance. Okay, It's the first time we've had this criterion of substance introduced. For a substance is a sort of underlying subject, and a nature is always in an underlying subject. And these things are also in accord with nature, as too is whatever belongs intrinsically to them. As spatial movement upward belongs to fire, for this is neither is nor has a nature, but is by nature and in accord with nature. But that last part gets a little bit quizzical. So maybe we can explore it a little bit. But besides the intrinsic versus coincidental aspect, do you see anything new or explanatory of what already came before being offered in these paragraphs? I'm going to open up the floor here for a minute. Sandy, please.
Oh, I actually wanted to say something not related to that, but just about the whole reading and just a question about what we should think about in the interim. So if somebody else wanted to respond to that, I'll save my comment for last.
I mean, one thing that might be confusing is he calls a substance an underlying subject. And before, when we were working through the concept of change, it was precisely matter that was the underlying subject. And so that might have caused some confusion. I'm not quite sure if you remember back that far. But he says, a sort of underlying subject. And so not matter as such, but like matter. All right, so if there's nothing else, then let's just get at this one thing and see what it has to say. What is he talking? What point do you think he's making with fire at the end of the passage I wrote? It's a little bit, I don't know, it's a little bit confusing. So we should probably talk about it and clear it up.
Where is that? I'm sorry.
Yeah, I don't see it.
Oh, the last couple lines I read, let me reread them. At the bottom of page 20, and these things are also in accord with nature, as too is whatever belongs intrinsically to them, as spatial movement upward belongs to fire. For this neither is nor has a nature, but is by nature and in accord with nature. Now, part of Aristotle's concern is always is stating not only what nature is, but what is by nature, right? Or what is naturally, what acts out its own being naturally, right? And therefore in accord with nature, what one would expect from a natural being. So he's concerned with all three of these perspectives. And this fire example just kind of gives us a little bit of a handhold on something that is neither a nature nor has a nature, but is by nature, is in the sense of exists naturally and in accord with nature. So I just wanted to look at that a little more closely and hear thoughts you might have about it. Philip.
Can I?
Tyler, go ahead. Tyler, go ahead, and then we got Philip and Clark and Brendan, and then Sandy. So in order to squeeze everything in, maybe we can be terse, but go ahead. It's a hard passage. Philip.
Okay, well, one thing I feel must be relevant, but I can't figure out how to make it relevant, is the fact that in a lot of Aristotle, he will talk about things that occur, and nobody doubts that they occur, but somehow you can't have knowledge of them because they differ from nature. So one example would be a physical deformity. So, you can see somebody with, let's say, a club foot,
Right.
And now in the contemporary world, we would say, well, let's get some knowledge of club feet. Let's learn about them. And Aristotle would say what you can have knowledge of is the proper form. So the healthy person, the healthy feet, the properly constructed feet. And then there's just sort of deviations from that, which you can't really have knowledge of. Now, anytime he's sort of talking about, well, you know, playing, getting a little tricky with the word nature, that's what I'm thinking of. I can't see how to apply that to the fire example, but maybe somebody else can.
Okay, thanks for that comment. That is a very interesting point. Yeah, Clark.
Yeah, I'm really just thinking about what Philip just said.
Cool.
Yeah, but so there's something. So the wording here is so.
Yeah.
So
Aristotelian.
Is that the word for it? Aristotelian, yeah. So there's, I mean, it's another way of talking about what's intrinsic. So as spatial movement belongs to fire.
Right.
How can, so spatial movement belongs to fire.
Spatial movement upward.
Yeah.
Well, any sort of spatial, yeah, fire is upward movement, but it could be the thing that as if spatial movement belongs to anything. Is the question I have. But what he seems to be saying here is that there's something, this is a deeper level of intrinsicness. It's in accord with nature.
Yeah.
It's by nature.
Right.
In law, you know, huge distinction between that and something else that has a nature.
Right. So if we think about,
that's all.
No, that's great. No. Part of the question is what is this for this neither is nor has a nature? What is this referring to, right? And it helps understand he's talking about the spatial movement of fire and not fire itself. But I'm going to take a couple other, and Sandy, don't disappear unless you have to, because I wanted to get your more general question, because I'm sure it will be very helpful for everybody to hear a little discussion about that. But in the meantime, I got Brendan and then Richard and Tom.
Yeah, so I was kind of connecting the, so he was talking about, okay, so here's my thought. The spatial movement upward of fire is not fire itself. It is a changing of fire. And so it's not the fire that is by nature, but it's its change itself as distinguished from the fire that is by nature. It's a form of change.
Right.
Is that kind of what you're trying to get to?
Yeah, I think that's definitely an important part of this. So thanks for pointing it out. Richard, you're next.
Is this basically getting like, I mean, it's kind of packed in a way that's like kind of hard, a little bit hard to decipher, but is it getting to some of the eternal stuff we were talking about before?
It might be, but that's not what I have in mind.
Oh, okay.
Or I don't think you need to appeal to that I think it's more of a logical issue rather than a cosmological question of eternity.
Okay, never mind that.
But no, thanks. It's important to explore all these different options to narrow in on what's going on here. Tom, please.
I take this section to state a necessary relationship between the movement and fire, as to say that there is, well, let's use it, a causal relationship that is necessary.
Oh, excellent. Yeah, no, I agree. But what happened to the text? Is anybody still sharing it? Well, right, so I'm just going to reread it again. All right. And these things are also in accord with nature, right? They're not nature, they're in accord with nature as to whatever belongs intrinsically to them. So which is to say that if something is a natural thing, it will have intrinsic properties. But those intrinsic properties are not themselves separate natural things with their own principle of motion. Okay, So the thing like fire has principle of motion. When fire happens, it acts or it moves or changes in very characteristic ways, right? And this, what it does is it ascends, it goes upwards. And then he says, this is neither is going upwards, neither is nor has a nature. Why not? Because it doesn't, going upwards is a motion. It doesn't have a principle of motion. It is the motion. It's the actualization of motion, the kind of motion that fire is capable of. So we've got this little logical, he's like shutting off a little logical regress, that the properties of fire are in motion, but because they're properties of fire, they are the actualization of fire's inner principle of change. And they don't have their own principles of change, because if they had their own principles of change, then they would move in a way different from fire. And if they did that, well, let's say they would move horizontally, then we would need a new principle of change to get at this new motion. So this is the thing. Motions don't have principles of change. They are the actualization of the principles of change that certain substances have. Okay, so that's why the fire, when it moves, when it ascends, or when it goes upward, is acting according to nature and is not itself. The movement upwards is not its own nature. It is motion, but it's the motion of the fire. It's not separate. And in virtue of this, we don't have the problem of the infinite regress that Aristotle's often helpfully shutting down. So what is by nature or according to nature are characteristic orderly motions that certain substances that are grounded in the inner intrinsic being, the inner nature of certain things, so-called natural beings. All right, and it's because things have an inner nature that it's even possible for us to talk about violence. But when you do violence to something, you're violating its nature. Things that don't have a nature, you can't do violence to. But natural beings, animals, plants, and interestingly, the cosmos, the totality of earth, air, fire, and water, right? These are substances, and therefore they have, and they're natural. They're natural because they have certain characteristic motions that are part of what they are, and they're not. Those motions are not imposed on them from the outside. And it's that, so to speak, self-actualization that we're getting at in the concept of nature here, and that's being set off against the artifact as being what it is thanks to something other than itself. What's natural is what it is thanks to itself, in virtue of itself. All right, I think that's that point's pretty clear. I'm going to hit Sandy's general question, and then I'm happy to stick around and field any questions or hear any more remarks today. And anyway, Sandy.
Yeah, thanks. I was just I just wanted to ask about the general gist of the reading that we had today from 1 to 3, even though we didn't do the full thing. So I actually feel like this whole section is the first time where I feel like I could go back and read it and maybe understand the first time for me that I feel that way about Aristotle. And I just wanted to ask, when I do go back and reread it or preparing for next time, just kind of like what maybe were the things you really wanted us to kind of focus on, like in 2.
All right.
And then my understanding of 3 is he's kind of taking a leap away from all these examples, and he's kind of giving us a bit of a reveal of his conclusions here. with the causes and stuff.
Right.
And that was exciting for me because, you know, I've been waiting for him to do that for a while now. And I just wanted to make sure that I understood that correctly.
Right.
I don't want to draw conclusions that are false, but that was kind of my understanding. And then if you could say something about the totality of these chapters and kind of what we should focus on when we reread, and what maybe, because, you know, it's, for example, like when we were talking about the substance thing,
Right.
what was it again? Like, it's really easy to get hung up on that. But for example, when I read it, I didn't actually. I just kind of continued, and I was like,
Right.
assuming that it would make sense to me the more I started understanding what he was going to say, you know? So and I know that people have told me not to read Aristotle like that, but I do have this sense that he is going to be coherent at some point. So I'm just like, it's okay. I'm not going to freak out and like, he said that, and I just kind of take it at face value and keep reading to see sort of like how he's going to fold it all in or bring it together. Right. So, you know, I mean, I appreciate you pointing out the things that could possibly confuse us, but can you also point out the things that will do the opposite as we read? Like, what are some of the things he's talking about in these next sections that we should really be, because you mentioned the doctor example. So I want you to just give us a little bit of some highlights so that we can focus on it when we're reading, if you could.
Oh yeah. Okay. You know, I'm going to be disappointing here a little bit because I do tend to dig into the oddities, because I know that they are stumbling blocks for reading, for getting the larger picture that Aristotle is offering. But what I wanted to get at, and I wanted to make the distinction that we've been making between nature and techne, or physics and techne, and how they're opposed here. And how each one is illuminating of the other. And then I wanted to look kind of generally on what he has to say about the dialectical progression that he goes through to get from, is matter the substance of a natural thing, or is it rather form? And he'll come out on the side of form. We learn a little bit more about matter and a little bit more of form here that I hope will be helpful when we get back to the metaphysics. The second section, I want to talk about a little bit of what he says it's about, you know, the difference between the kind of thing the mathematician studies and the kind of thing that the natural scientists study, because they seem to coincide. And then I wanted to dig into the importance of snub noses for Aristotle. Which sounds perverse.
I appreciate that, because when I read that, I was like, I don't think this is really important, and I kind of just fudged over it. So
he comes back to snubness and snub noses over and over again. And so just like he does the idea that, you know, the doctor is only accidentally a healer of himself, right? He's intrinsically a healer, but only accidentally a healer of himself. Those kind of distinctions run so deep in Aristotle, and I think it's just really important, you know, regardless of what the bigger picture is, to get a handle on those things. So that was one of the main things I wanted to do in chapter 2, was get at the snubness, and then what kind of light it casts on the other points he was making. And then in 3, you know, now that we're saturated in change and matter and form, and we've even gotten some of potency and activity, I wanted to go back to the 4 causes and look at them against that background. We hit this section once in the metaphysics when he referred to them in book 1, and since everything was foreign and strange, the 4 causes were foreign and strange. And it's another opportunity to go back and look at them and look at the kind of examples he uses, and then really think about, you know, I mean, I would love to think about, maybe we won't get to it, is why he uses so many examples from the realm of art and techne in order to explain what's going on in nature, even though he is the one who opened up the gap between them and distinguishes them as two ontologically different kinds of things. So I wanted to reflect on that a little bit. So look at the causes, and then I wanted to get to to Tristan's point and look at how I want to look at these teleological causes, the telos, the for the sake of which, and I want people to see how modest they are. That this is not some grand cosmic scheme where everything is determined to find its own place and to realize itself and all the rest of it. So I wanted to gauge a little bit of, I wanted to delimit our understanding of these final causes or these ends. So those were my goals. But I hear what you're saying, Sandy. And so maybe what I'll try to do at the beginning of next time is just do a quick summary of the main points. And that way people can jump in at main points where they either didn't get or would love more clarification. So yeah, that's what I have to say to your question.
Thanks, that was great.
Oh, awesome. All right, well, we've dwindled down to the committed few. So you're the most important people to hear this, that right, we are now meeting, well, we will do textual readings like we've been doing for the last hour, every other week. But in between those weeks, I will be available for more general conversations about modernity and antiquity and some of the differences and some of the problems you're having with Aristotle and some of the things that you just aren't sitting well with you. So we can have more kind of general personal discussions on our off weeks. And so kind of what we did the first hour, I'm going to put on our off weeks. And what we did in our second hour is going to be the totality of our, proper Aristotle reading group. So I'm going to divvy it up like that. The other thing to add to this is that the kind of free-ranging, free-for-all, where we can talk about anything, will be the second hour. And in the first hour, since I know you're all free to be here, that's when I'm going to offer the Arbogast-Schmidt reading group, because I think that there is no better book written in the 21st century that prepares you through your own self-critique about a number of assumptions you make about knowledge and reality. Nothing prepares you better to be receptive to the kind of thinking that, receptive but not credulous of the kind of thinking that we encounter in Plato and Aristotle. So several of us did a reading group in this book. I think all of us found it fundamental and even perhaps transformative in our whole understanding of philosophy. And since now we have so many people who are interested in Aristotle, I want to take advantage of that and use this Arbogast-Schmidt book, Platonism and Modernity, which is basically about Aristotle, but he calls it Platonism, right, as a way to cast additional light on some of the themes that I'm focusing on in Aristotle, but also some of the structure and backbone of Aristotle's thinking itself. So, right, that's what I got in terms of announcements. So next week, it's just going to be a free-for-all next Tuesday. The Tuesday after that, we will do text work like we did the second half of this seminar. And then the Thursday after that, we will do 1 hour of Schmidt, and then I will be posting that on Meetup, and then 1 hour of free-for-all. And it can be Schmidt related or Aristotle related or both. But yeah, that's how I'm envisioning things. Clark, I see you waving. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, no, I'm just celebrating. I think that's a great plan. I wanted to ask you, what's going to be recorded and what isn't? And also, did we have a recording